We're going to move into the last part of the program this afternoon, and that's a landowner panel. And I'm going to ask, we've got 3 landowners who are here on the program, one who we've added in, who you've met before, and that's Mark Shepard, and then we're going to have Dusty Walter speaking on behalf of Brian Tomasi, who couldn't make it. So I'm going to ask each landowner to come up and introduce themselves briefly. We'll pull up a PowerPoint or whatever it is and have you speak for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll just open it up for questions and discussion. And the first landowner we'd like to have come up will be Bill Stauffer.
All right, I'm Bill Stauffer, farmer from Saline County, recovering state senator, and about 7 years ago, 8 years ago, we're looking at moving the farm from us to the kids, and wanted to prepare something that would be self-sustaining. And so we got into the chestnut business, and when we first planted chestnuts, we had these little whips that were 20 feet apart, 30-foot lanes, and there was a lot of space in between. So over the next couple of years, we started experimenting with what it took to fill up that space. And hopefully we got a picture or two here somewhere.
Technology is fun. Oh,
there we go.
Oh. Okay, cool.
All right, so we started out. That's all right. We'll go to the second there, and we started out with just wire protection for our chestnut trees. We planted pumpkins in between. As you see, pumpkins are very, very aggressive, and this worked for a year or two. So we started growing pumpkins in the middle and taking care of the trees. And it's interesting though that there's no way to keep a pumpkin under control. It goes, but that's the way we started out. And then we actually grew pumpkins. Then we started experimenting. This is sweet corn, and that worked very well. And then in the background, see wheat. My preference is wheat, simply because it uses the moisture when the chestnuts don't need it, and then it's gone in the when the chestnuts need the moisture, the wheat is through, and then we mulch that, and it makes a tremendous material to pick up the chestnuts on. They're clean, and it works pretty well. It still gives you some income in between. We raised 70 bushel wheat last year between the rows, and so it fits good, and it actually makes harvest very, very helpful. So that's mature wheat. We got a little K combine, 13-foot head that we combine the wheat with, and you can see the chestnuts are blooming in that picture. Oops. One of the things you have to do is protect the chestnuts from deer, and so we moved from the cages to fence, and they are tenacious animals. Let me clue you. And I don't know whether the next picture. If you look at the gate over here in the corner, we've actually got a cattle panel on the bottom and pipe on top, because I got it down to where I had just one doe and her fawn, and I did not figure out where they were getting in. Finally, they were crawling underneath that gate. So, but we actually are producing chestnuts now and enjoy it. I used to raise 2,500 acres of row crop, and I have as much fun with the chestnuts and the pumpkins as I did with the row crop. So if you can handle a deer, we've also planted acre and a half of elderberries, and that's going to go to 5, and so labor-wise it works out a lot better. So we're enjoying it. It's just basically Sue Ellen and I, and we have a lot of fun at it.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'll have John Buchanan come up and speak for a few minutes, and they'll pull your presentation up.
All right, first, I'm John Buchanan. I'm from Kansas, so I'm sort of a migrant over here to Missouri today. But I'm a full-time farmer, both livestock and row cropping. And about a year ago, no, about 6 years ago, my wife decided she didn't want livestock around the house anymore. Can you imagine that she did not want livestock around the house? Anyway, she's got into it with the Kansas Forestry Service about agroforestry. So we literally took 200 acres of our terraced farm ground out of production. 7 years ago, this had soybeans on it. These sites that you're looking at are tree sites. This is where we start. This is a year before we're going to plant. We take this with a subsoiler, make these tree sites, keep them completely bare for a year. We, use glyphosate to keep the weeds and grass out of them. And they're tilled about 4 times during the summer to keep it aerated, whatever. We'll put 4-year-old composted manure in these right after we till them the first time. They're on 25-foot centers. This is prepared to put the trees in. We go along, put a 2-inch stake in the center of it, come by with a sharpshooter, plant 8 to 10-inch bare root seedlings. That's a seedling in the hole. That's where we started out. When we got the trees planted, same day we come along, we put a 48-inch tree protector on it. Now, these are Tree Pro tree protectors. They do 2 things. They keep the deer from bothering them, and they act like a mini greenhouse. They will add about, according to Tree Pro, about 3 months growing season on your seedlings by keeping the soil a little warmer in the fall, warming it up a little more in the spring. So they're an investment. Right after we get them all planted, they're all tamped down. This wagon behind the tractor has 4 barrels on it. They're individually controlled. One of them has water in, one of them has water with lime in it, and another one with liquid fertilizer, with 2 different kinds of liquid fertilizer. We literally check the pH on each one of these tree sites, usually about once or twice a year. And they're all numbered. Every tree has a number, just like our cattle. They have an ear tag. Well, these have a number and a GPS location. My wife can go in her computer, pull up any tree that you come to and say, I want to know what number 127, what its history is. It'll tell you the day it was planted. It'll tell you how much fertilizer has been put on it. It'll tell it every time it's been sprayed for insects. It'll tell you how many acre feet of water we put on it during the years it was dry. So every tree is totally tracked. The day it was pruned, not it was done this year, the date will be in there, who did it, whatever was pruned off of it. So we keep meticulous records on these trees, just like we do cattle. We have had about a 2% loss of all seedlings we planted. So we have about a 98% success rate on all of our trees. This is a stand of black walnuts. These were some of the first ones we planted. These are 6 years old, believe it or not. And you see we still keep the ground completely bare around them. Well, now this is hay in between. They're planted on 25-foot centers. This summer we had, of course, rain. We made 3 cuttings off this cold season grass. We actually, my wife can tell you how much we lost in hay production after we planted the trees compared to the first year when it was just hay and no trees. And it's very little. But we have always turned a profit on this ground. This ground has never lost money, even though we've got the trees in it. The hay has been supporting it. So this is kind of our project. And as far as agroforestry goes, it's working. and it actually is turning a profit. It's not something in the future. This is what looks like. This is just a little broader view of all the trees. We have white oak, red oak, pecan, black walnut, black cherry, bur oak, and we're about to plant 200 sugar maples in April. So that is kind of my agroforestry project, along with all the other projects I have. We farm about 11,000 acres. That's an individual black walnut. That tree is only 6 years old, believe it or not. It started out as an 8-inch bare seedling.
So this is what you do in your spare time then?
What spare time? Actually, my wife figured out that if we figured out all the hours I work for about $5 an hour. These are all just pictures of that, and that was the end of it. But anyway, that's our forestry project, and like I said, I'm a full-time farmer and always have been, and this has been one of the best experiments we have ever tried with actually restoring the land and what have you. So we're eventually going to have probably about 1,500 acres in trees. We're getting into 200 to 300 a year. But we found that if you try planting more than that, the fact that the first year is so critical of keeping them alive and checking on them, that it's not practical. And we try not to use any of our hired help unless it's really necessary to water trees or whatever. But one of the big things, if you want to be successful in planting trees or anything like that, is prepare the ground way before you plant. You cannot go out, dig up, rototill, whatever, stick trees in the ground and expect them to do well. We literally prepare 1 year ahead of time. As soon as we plant in April, we prepare those sites for the next year, and then we keep them that way all summer. And literally the whole tree sites now, we keep them bare with actually spot spraying. And the secret is you got to have equipment. You cannot, this is not something you can do by hand. You need, you know, we bought a small 55 horsepower tractor, a Kawasaki mule set up with 50-gallon spray tanks on it for pasture guard and glyphosate. The first year we don't cut the hay when the trees are small. We want to keep it cut down all the time, because if you're going to get any rodent problems, that's when you'll get it that first year. So we have a 35 horsepower diesel bad boy that has a 6-foot mower deck on it. It's like the biggest riding lawnmower you ever saw. And we can go out and mow 50, 60 acres in 2 days. And that's mowing, you know, 12-inch high grass. And a lot of times when it rains, we will mow our new trees 3 to 4 times a summer, which, you know, is 2 days daylight to dark on that machine. You couldn't do it with anything else. So preparation and taking care of them is the key if you want them to look like that when you're done. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, John. The next presenter is going to be Eric Reuter. Eric, I'm not sure what your PowerPoint looks like, so when you come up here, we'll find it.
All right, well, they're getting that finished up. We'll assume it'll pop up here sooner or later. My name is Eric Reuter. Along with my wife, Joanna, we run Hollow Farm, a diversified farm in northern Boone County. I was told 10 minutes. I carefully prepared this talk for 10 minutes. I'm going to take 10 minutes, so if you want to yell at me later, go for it, but that's what I'm going to do. So my wife and I are geologists by training. We used to specialize in looking at landscapes and erosion rates, especially long-term erosion rates and human effects on the landscape. That still informs our management decisions as farmers. We do tend to think long-term, and we have been on the land we're on for about 8 years. We've been farming it full-time for the last 5. So what I'm going to do today is give you a bit of a visual tour through some of the things we have done and are doing on our place that'll tie into the agroforestry idea. Part of what we do, we started out as an annual vegetable farm, growing a lot of different annual vegetables, started building other diversification, dairy goats, pastured hogs, chickens, timber crops, fruit. We kind of do it all and kind of run ourselves in a little hamster wheel of doing it. But we believe very strongly in diversity as a response to variability of climate, given the theme of today's talk. So Let's see, I'm not sure. Is this? There we go. All right, so I'm going to give you a real brief. Most of this talk is visual. I think we've all seen enough text slides for the day, so this is mostly a nice visual talk for you. This is our starting point, 2007 aerial photo. This is a very typical landscape for central Missouri. It's an abandoned farm. It's a hillside and valley landscape that is mostly overgrown in scrub cedars and young hardwoods that are crowding each other out. Land hasn't been farmed in about 40 years, and it looks it, and the soil looks it. So this is a landscape that's all too common around here. It doesn't produce any food. Our vision for this is we can take pieces of land like this and turn them back into something productive. This doesn't even exist in discussion of agricultural possibility because this kind of land doesn't exist in the wider models, but it's everywhere. And we believe strongly in trying to take a piece of land like this and do something useful with it. So what I'm going to show you here is some of what we started doing on this land, keeping in mind that our two goals are both to produce food for our local community for sale and food for ourselves. We don't believe in living on a farm that has to import food. To us, that's pointless. We feed ourselves first, and we feed the rest of the area if we can. Okay, this image is already almost 4 years old, but it's 4 years after the first image. What I'm going to try to do is give you a quick tour in the coming slides over some of the work we've been doing. We have the opposite problem of Mark Shepard here. We have too many trees, and they're all useless. Because what we have is a huge swath of cedar, overgrown cedar monoculture that doesn't support anything. It doesn't let sun on the ground, it doesn't produce food, it doesn't produce wildlife habitat. It's useless. So we've had to do a lot of clearing to get back to a place that we can do something with. So in certain areas, this hillside above the house, we've cleared a bunch of this out of some very large, thick cedar to start an orchard planting. We've cleared a bunch of cedars out around growing areas just to let sun get back in these bottomland fields. We've done a lot of thinning. This pasture started out pretty much as a brush lot. It's now basically a savanna silvopasture. This area, again, it doesn't look it, but 4 years on, we really started bringing sun down into this to get more of our goat herds in there. And basically, we've just been targeting work where we can on thinning out both the cedars and these sort of overgrown young hardwoods that are all competing with each other. They're stressed. There's too many of them. They produce very irregular masts. We can do a lot more with these if we can get these into a healthier forest or into a combined pasture. So I'm going to try to work quickly through showing you how we've done some of this. And start with the cedars, because in this case, we're basically clear cutting in some cases, but we also believe in resource conservation. So we're going to look at how we've used these resources. We don't believe in the bulldoze and burn model of restoring land. We want to make use of the stuff we have here even as we're transitioning it. So when we take down a cedar tree, we use every part of it. Starting with a tree, medium to small posts will become fence posts, which we have a wide use for around acres of goat pasture. Growing goats and vegetables and fruit trees means you need fence posts. Saw logs, the larger logs become saw logs. We've sold timber almost every winter for years, and the timber work has actually paid for itself. And we basically get all the free lumber we need because we sell enough to pay for our own costs. We'll talk about that. So the lumber goes to both our own buildings and our income. The milling scrap off of milling the saw logs becomes a bunch of things, including firewood, and actually we make money off that too. So we'll talk about the firewood use. We chip most of the branches of the cedar trees and hardwoods down to mulch on the farm and turn that natural material back onto farm useful material. We burn what little is left of the tree that we can't use to produce biochar, and that's something I'll talk about again in a minute, but we're still trying to sequester carbon and keep the natural material from the land on the land. So I'm going to give you a real quick visual tour here of what all these things look like. So there's the lumber, and we do all the logging work ourselves, bring in a portable mill, and have that milled up, and we've sold lumber to people for garden sheds, garden beds, decking projects. Again, the timber work here for clearing cedars off the land has paid for itself. We actually make a better wage doing this than we do farming. As Mark pointed out, it doesn't pay for itself as a career, but it pays for the part of the time we spend doing it, and that's important. So here's lumber in use on the farm. We built all of our outbuildings. Again, this farm was abandoned when we got it. There was nothing there but a house, and we've started over, so we've built a lot of buildings. In fact, this one here is basically this huge cedar tree cut and reassembled on site. I tell people I just take them down and reassemble them in a more useful way. There's a huge, about 22-inch stump in the middle of that. There's actually a workbench built on top of that stump in there. But most of the framing of that building is that cedar tree. So it works out pretty well for us. Again, no lumber is being shipped in. It's all being generated from what most of the state would consider junk. And for us, it's an extremely useful material because we take the time to do it. Fences and trellises. These two styles of fences, both the rail fence and the board fence here, this is milling scrap. Most people would burn this. The other side of that is rough bark milling cut. But we put it back, you put it up front side out, it looks real nice. You pile it up in a rail fence, you've got an attractive rail fence for your boundary. Again, we don't have to throw it away or burn it. Thin cedar poles thinned out of our rail fix stands become trellises for bean plantings. Medium-sized cedar poles become a real nice rail fence, 2 T-posts on the side, and you've got a real solid fence. And that's been a great way to recycle these huge thickets of just junk cedar we've got. And then this is our orchard fence. That's welded wire and electric line with small cedar poles, and again, milling scrap and bracing in there. Again, virtually free from clearing the land, and that has kept deer out of the orchard for, about 4 years since we put it up. We've never had a deer in the orchard with that particular approach. And again, all the metal on there is recycled from farm auctions, from other people going out of business. So it's cost us relatively little. Cedar firewood, you don't want to put cedar in your home chimney. It'll sit up your chimney, but it works really well. It's a nice hot burn for an outdoor use. We use cedar firewood to make the the hot piles we need for hog butchering in the winter. It heats your water real fast for dunking hogs. And we also sell a lot of our stumps and scrap over the past years to a nearby dairy who's actually in the room, who uses an outdoor wood furnace to heat their pasteurizer in their dairy. And so we've been able to supply a lot of our cedar scrap that we can't use to them. They burn it, but it turns into goat cheese and home heat. And that's also a pretty useful balance for us. We sometimes just trade it for other products that they produce that we don't use. So that farm has actually used some of our lumber in their barn projects as well. Mulch, we chip almost all the cedar branches that we can manage. We have an on-farm chipper runs off our PTO. The cedar chips all go into paths. This means we don't have to we do almost no mowing. We basically don't maintain paths. They're all cedar mulch, and every year we cut enough cedar to regenerate the path. Sometimes we fall behind, but it's a good idea. The hardwood mulch we cut goes to our orchards. So we use a lot of hardwood mulch, again, from thinning these overgrown hardwoods that need to be thinned anyway. That stuff gets mulched, goes on and produces a better fungal environment at the base of the fruit trees. And we don't have to buy hay or something in to do that. And we know the mulch is clean, which is not always the case with purchased stuff. So biochar, we take the real junk of the cedar tree we can't use and we burn it to create a form of biochar. This is still a kind of ill-defined concept, but the idea is a form of charcoal that we can produce. The idea is that it sequesters carbon back into the ground and it helps retain some nutrients in water. This has been studied in various cases where you have a kind of our own on-farm experiment going with it. I can tell you that where we've done this, we have seen water retention. In the drought of 2012, and most of our pastures were just burned dry. Every biochar pit we'd burned in the last few years looked like a big green volcanic island. It was spectacular. There was a growth a foot high on some of these piles. And so that tells us something is going right in how this is being used, although we're still not certain overall the right balance of using it. But it gives us encouragement to keep doing this instead of just burning brush piles for no benefit. So I'm going to move on to really quickly look at some other agroforestry products we get off our place, both things that we manage and things that we forage for. Obviously, regular home firewood's a big one. We heat our house solely with wood, and so that is required. Shiitake mushrooms are a great one. We actually can thank the Agroforestry Center for this because years ago we saw a talk on this, went out and did it, and so now as we're doing TSI work, thinning all of our young hardwoods, about the size we're thinning, these logs about this big are perfect for growing shiitake mushrooms. This is something we do in the winter when we're not that busy relative to summer. And it produces a really nice shiitake mushroom crop for us, and this has been one of our more popular farm crops that we can sell as these big things. We're basically creating value out of thinning an overgrown forest. So we're very happy with this, and we thank the Agroforestry Center for getting us started on this particular project. Meat and pest control is a great way to use woods. Deer are the fundamental enemy of almost everything we do on our farm, and so we try to knock back the little boogers every time we can. But again, we're harvesting food from managing the woods, and we've actually started spending more time doing TSI to help with the hunting possibilities, and we actually have a bow hunter who has become interested in actually leasing hunting rights on the land in the coming year. So we're also generating value from our land by doing agroforestry work that improves the forest environment. Fruit trees, we've got an orchard going. Mark would laugh at us because it's a pretty traditional open orchard without a lot of polyculture in there, but it's an orchard. We've taken cedar scrub and turned it into food production. We started getting fruit for the first time this spring. So that's something we're excited about as putting in food and fruit crops on a previously useless piece of land. Pine straw mulch, we've got a pine tree plantation going. We'd like to get more blueberries going, and acidification is sometimes difficult to do, especially in an organic system. So we're hoping these pine trees will start to develop big enough, fast enough that we can harvest the pine mulch, move it over 50 feet, and put it on blueberries. It's a goal. Maple syrup's a great one. We have productive sugar maples. The last few years, we've been able to produce pretty much almost all of our household maple supply, again, in the time of year that we're able to do it. We routinely, on a good sugar maple, will fill a 3-gallon bucket like that every day. And that produces a pretty good amount of maple syrup. And again, the wood fire down there that spends days burning it down, all cedar milling scrap. We're taking junk off the farm, turning it into maple syrup. Love it. So foraging mushrooms, every Missourian knows about this, but it's another way to use our woods. Nuts and seeds, we run dairy goats, we run pastured hogs at times, we run pastured chickens, and we can use some of these forest crops as food. The hogs, they much prefer acorns to those rotten, overgrown tomatoes down there. They will vacuum them up like nothing else. And so here's another way that we can take these resources. Locust pods, we have a lot of productive locust trees. This is candy to a goat. They will charge for them, vacuum them up, and it's a legume. It's adding some balance to their diet. They love them. We'll actually collect bags of these in the fall and store them for midwinter feeding, when we can just take a feed sack of these things back to the barn and start dumping out candy for the goats. Love it. So finally, we're actually in a bit of transition on our farm. We started out as a pretty traditional annual crop farm. We've become more and more interested in polyculture and perennial plantings, and we're looking at moving more toward the idea of looking at what already grows naturally in the landscape and trying to transition that way. We're a little burned out on the annual vegetable cycle, and we're trying something new. So we're looking at, we have all these things that grow naturally already: elderberry, gooseberry, grape, mulberry, pawpaw, persimmon. These are all Missouri natives that we can both cultivate wild and we can start to introduce. So we're looking into converting some of our annual vegetable fields into domestic planting of these things somewhat in the permaculture line, stacked things. We already have the soil prepared from 7 years of no-till vegetable farming. We've got good beds for these and the water in place. So we're looking at trying to do some of this. And I have a note in here to remind me an earlier speaker pointed out that some of the farmers in this room are rare ducks. The kind of unusual diversification land management we're trying to do, a lot of the establishment just sees people like us as quacks. But it's something that we feel passionate about. We're trying to find a way to make it economically viable. We have not really succeeded in making it as viable as we'd like to, but we're intrigued by the ideas of agroforestry and polyculture to get us toward a position that we can make this useless, abandoned piece of land produce something for us and our consumers again. So I think I probably went a little over, but this whole day has gotten more ideas in my head that I wanted to mention. So that's where we're coming from. That's how to find us and follow us, and I'll sit down in my chair now.
Thank you. Well, that was inspirational. We were going to have Brian Tomasi here, and he couldn't make it, so Dusty Walter has been kind enough to come in and pinch hit for Brian, right?
Yes.
Now, Dusty, I'm going to let you find your PowerPoint and pull it up. I just wanted to make a comment in terms of, the comment about folks being odd ducks. If you go to the Moses Conference or the Pennsylvania Sustainable Ag Conference, et cetera, you see thousands of people going to these every year. So if there's getting to be a very large pond of odd ducks out there, I must say. It's not a rare bird anymore.
Well, I think if anybody came here today thinking that they were going to hear the answer and the one-size-fits-all, then you're in the wrong room, right? When you talk about adaptability and resilience, and I've forgotten which talk I heard it in now, but it's as much about you, the landowner, what makes you happy, what equipment, what setting you've got to apply this into. So it is really about your adaptability of what you hear today that's going to create a success story. And this is a case study about Brian Tomasi's farm. I'm superintendent on one of the research farms for the University of Missouri down in the central part of the state of Missouri, but I did agroforestry technology transfer for 10 years or so. So my association with this research farm allowed me to talk with Brian about silvopasture. And so Brian Tomasi saw what we were doing with silvopasture, and this is really his story about taking the information that we presented and adapting that to his farm and applying it in a way that he feels has been very successful for him on the farm. So he's got 210 acres, 31 paddocks. He's a cow-calf operator. And I think we're going to kind of blaze through this just to get to to some of the pictures and also then to the bottom line, the economics and why he finds this to be successful. But he does have a rotational grazing system, and his reason for adopting was to improve the productivity of his animals, especially over the summer. So this is an overhead of one part of his farm. He took 3 areas and thinned those areas out. You can't see it very good, but this represents a paddock down here. There's a paddock up above. There's a larger paddock over here, and then there's one down below. He has a centralized watering system in the middle. And so he took these edges along that he typically fenced his cattle out of the woods. He bumped his fence down into the woods a little bit and also thinned, and we'll see some side shots of these thinned out woods. Overall, he's got 3 edges that he thinned that represents a total of no more than about 3 acres in size that he thinned out these forests The goal being that after the cattle water out here in the middle, they work back across here eating forage, get down into the shade to reduce their stress level, and ruminate a little bit. So here's one of the edges, edge number 1, edge number 2. You can notice the freshly established grass in there as well where he's removed the trees. Again, looking for a light environment that is to enhance the forage production underneath that shaded canopy. And there's the third area. I think this is a good spot to interject as well, that Brian likes to hunt, and his family and his kids, they like to hunt. One of the real benefits that he's seen from this is that this transitional area from open pasture to fully stocked forest, they really enjoy hunting in these areas. And so he's enjoyed this so much that in the subsequent years, he's gone in and created some more of these little edge thinnings, if you will, that integrate with his grazing system, but also they're where he and his family enjoy going to hunt. You can see the animals and get them as they come out in this transitional area. The bottom line economic analysis, and this was put together by, used to work for the Center for Agroforestry, Larry Godsey, he was our economist. So this was put together by Larry. During 2010, it was a hot summer in that south central Ozarks portion. But from June 15th to August 15th, he saw an average daily gain on his calves of 1.6 to 2.1 pounds per day, when landowners adjacent to him were either seeing zero gain in terms of pounds on their animals or a loss in weight. And if you notice Rob Kallenbach's slides today, you can also see a loss in weight in your animals over the winter, right? When animals are stressed, they're less efficient in the use of their feed, and they burn more energy, especially over the winter. So Brian saw a weight gain where others in that area were actually seeing animals that didn't gain any weight. That resulted in 96 to 126 pounds per head of gain for that period from June 15th to August 15th. An addition of $130 to $170 per head, for a net increase in profit compared to not gaining at all of $10,000 to $14,000 on this area for his 84, I think it was 84 head of livestock for his cow-calf operation. So how does that work out with the cost of thinning and producing this? Brian has his own little bobcat with a little saw blade on the front of this skid steer. But he estimates that if he was charging someone to implement this and to put it in on their property, that he would charge about $1,200 an acre. So for the 3 acres, or a little under 3 acres, that's about $3,500 total. But when you compare that with the increase in profit that he made, there's a benefit to cost ratio of 3 to 4 times the investment. So it paid back to his farm, at least on those years when animals were really stressed. And I think that's one of the things that we try to promote in silval pasture especially, is that you don't need every acre with trees on it, but when there are stressful times, having these areas where animals can escape the heat or the cold, then you see a benefit in productivity. So that's a little bit about the Brian Tomasi story.
Okay, so, you want to sit up there? So we're going to invite Mark Shepard up again, just for a brief little, yes? Put on a different hat, talk a little more agroforestry, and then we'll just have an open discussion with the panelists. Okay.
So I realized that the last time, I never showed any pictures of our farm, except for the aerial photograph. This will be a little bit closer dialed in on some of the things we've got going on. I do like it that Eric wasn't afraid to pick on me. That was really heartening.
You'd like to do that.
Well, what is also kind of nice is that, you know, when I got started, like I said, there was hardly anybody doing this stuff. And then it's so nice to see other people are doing it. And 4 different examples, 5 different examples, not any one of us are doing it the same, yet we're using the same basic techniques. Early years, agroforestry, alley cropping, you know, we would tell people that we're doing agroforestry, take them on tours, like, well, where's the trees? I put this one in here because between these two little black lines here, there's our row of chestnuts. This just shows the root pruning. What we do is every year, at least once, we'll drag a subsoiler on either side of the row of trees to keep the tree roots from taking nutrient and moisture from our crops. Asparagus between chestnut trees. Once upon a time, I got in trouble by a professor who talks about chestnuts a lot. He's from Michigan. And I was saying that in the second year of planting chestnuts, we're grossing $4,000 an acre. And he flipped out, don't listen to this man, he's a heretic and all that kind of stuff. Well, we weren't making it off of chestnuts. It was coming off the asparagus. And what's also interesting about the root pruning is asparagus and chestnuts are somewhat incompatible. They're totally different soil types and preferences, so you can have different treatments for, here's a row of chestnut trees, they can get whatever amendments they might need to be happy, and here's the asparagus. So you can separate your farm into smaller spaces. These are about 45-foot spaces between rows of chestnut trees. Pumpkins, winter squash, we do a lot of produce. This is in between rows of hazelnut. These are hazelnut on this side and on that side. Sunflowers between rows of chestnut. I'm a member of a group of farmers that we converted our tractors to run on vegetable oil, and the growers in our group are getting about 140 gallons of vegetable oil per acre. Our whole 110-acre farm can run on 3 acres worth of sunflowers, and then the press cake is feed for livestock, and of course there's chestnuts thrown in there. A little bit earlier shot of the, this is, you can see the asparagus up, whoop, I didn't mean to advance yet. Asparagus, once again squash here, and you can see the rows of trees starting to emerge, and then just a few years later, it's emerged even further. So the systems are going to change through time. They're never going to look the same. Cattle, like I'd mentioned earlier, we don't use, no one element is like the farm. I'm not a cattle person, I'm not a pig person, I'm not a produce person. We're managing the whole system. We've had anywhere between 1 and 35 cattle on the 100 acres at any one point in time. Only seldom have we wintered animals over, mostly buying in stockers. Move them frequently, get them to mob as close as they can. They move through the system rather fast. As you can notice, we have a little free-range chicken running in the back here. Someone was mentioning about how the trees, the cattle love to rub on the trees. It's like, well, if we're going to be growing walnut for timber, we want to prune the branches down low. Let's use the cattle to rub on the branches and break them all off. They kind of look ugly at first, but they heal over and they do the pruning. They also do this out in my apple orchard, and when they browse the lower 5 feet, you basically short-circuit the scab cycles, and you won't have the fungus scab affecting your trees. And the mulberries are thrown in the system for pigs. Sheep in this case, and we've never had all of this happening repeatedly. It's all been episodic and periodic. Sometimes there's more of this and less of that, more in this and less of that. The sheep is the brush control. You can see the poly net, and they're taking out a thicket of staghorn sumac. We use various different tree species. This is ash. This is purely an area strictly for firewood. This is an example of what happens after you do alley cropping for a few years. Now the trees are getting bigger. I don't want to prune them too much. These are chestnuts. Instead of growing a produce crop down the middle of the alley, this is where we put in our elderberries and mulberries and grapes right down the middle of the row, currants underneath the chestnuts. Then we converted it into a silvopasture system. At first, we only had the animals going through periodically, but then we have 5 acres of the chestnut polyculture now that is exclusively the pig finishing area, and then we finish them on chestnut. And we put rings in their noses so they don't plow up the pasture because the grass is important to us. So the majority of their diet is grass. And they're pretty healthy, happy guys. So someone was also asking about harvesting. Well, when the chestnuts fall, so we go ahead, in most areas, you harvest the chestnuts first, then turn the pigs loose to clean up what we don't get. And right in the row where there's a tangle of other brush growing in the row, we never go in there to harvest it, so that's what the pigs do. Notice how they're right in line with the chestnut trees snuffling around. These are Tamworth Berkshire crosses. They're pretty thrifty on grass. I just put that picture in to show you that you can see that the cattle already went through once. They grazed the tops off the grass. Then the pigs would go in after them. The chickens scratch the manure pats apart. Turkeys are a little bit tough in silvopasture systems. Chickens figure out how to deal with predators. Turkeys die. And you just can't keep the chickens away from the livestock there because the sheep and the cattle are tossing up bugs all the time, and of course the animals. They just wanted to show you what happens after you get chickens to be free range. I mean, like free range. They go wherever they want, thousands of them. People say, don't you have a lot of problems with predators? Well, not with the smart ones. And those are not tame, domestic little barnyard chickens. Those are mean Jurassic chickens. So anyways, that's some of the stuff that we do out on New Forest Farm. Thank you.
So what do you do with the chicken?
Those are mostly for meat. And then it was a hodgepodge of dual-purpose breeds that were put together. And then the second year, eggs were kept back and then hatched. A friend of ours hatched them, and then they were tossed out again. And so we keep the oldest birds, the most wily birds that are able to duke it out in the wild, we keep them over the winter in a chicken coop. And we feed them a little bit of grain so they come up to you all the time, and then you scoop them up, put them in a bag, and sell them as meat birds.
I'm going to ask you how you harvest them with a shotgun or what?
Okay. Well, let's thank all of our farmer panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions. Again, I'll have you speak into a microphone and address any of the panelists that you like. There's quite a bit of diversity here that you just heard about in the last 45 minutes. So, questions? Toward the back.
Can you talk a little bit more about how, I know a couple of you mentioned hunters using the farms. Can you talk a little more about how implementing agroforestry on the farm is beneficial to hunters?
Who are you talking to?
Well, I know a few different people mentioned it.
Actually, I allow about anybody that wants to bow hunt to hunt. And yeah, I guess I'm too old or whatever, but I don't believe in charging people to hunt. So, you know, I like to hunt. I go out in western Kansas and hunt pheasants and things like that. Somebody comes up and knocks on my door and says, I understand you own this, I understand you own that. Would you mind if I bow hunt or whatever? I do not allow gun hunting because we have livestock. But basically anybody that comes and asks me to hunt, I let them hunt.
Do you find that the land attracts more animals?
I would say the bow hunters, I think bow season's almost over now. They've harvested 22 deer off our land.
And if you consider, like in our case, the year before we moved onto the farm, approximately a third of it was abandoned cropland. There was no wildlife being supported there. And then nowadays, we used to be the farm that deer went through. We're now the farm where deer come from, because we've got habitat all over the place. And turkeys, oh my goodness, turkeys just love chestnuts. Someone mentioned to me recently that you have to harvest all of your chestnuts or else you're going to get all these weevils on the ground, and you just got to get those chestnuts off the ground. If we don't harvest the chestnuts in the afternoon, they're not there in the morning. So wildlife's taking care of it.
In our case, two ways to look at that. One is that certain agroforestry practices like thinning trees and creating more open habitat, as I think you mentioned, can actually reproduce the kind of environment deer like. They like edge areas there. They're happy to be in kind of an edge area along the field. And so if you're opening up some of these silvopasture areas, they'll tend to move in there, and so that can make it easier to hunt. We actually did this in our woods this fall, did some opening up in certain areas. I knew there's deer trails. Sure enough, I got 2 deer within a few days out there. So, you know, that kind of thing can generate habitat and give you more value. If someone wants to pay you at least to come in and hunt, it helps to have a valuable piece of property that they'll want to pay for. And in our case, since we're full-time trying to earn a living at it, I have no problem taking someone's money for recreation if that's what they're interested in, because I'm making a living.
Actually, the Mossy Oak Company is selling lots of tree seedlings, and many and most tree planters these days, especially growing chestnuts, are doing it specifically as deer attractant. And actually, there's a product for sale that was for sale in Walmart. It was Leanne who found it for me first. It's basically chestnut flour. You sprinkle it all over the place as deer bait. So if people are going to Walmart to buy chestnut flour as deer bait, if you have chestnut trees grown, you're gonna have deer bait.
Well, there's actually, the university here, we had the fall field day on our ranch, and Dusty Walters at the end brought me some oak trees that were developed specifically to attract deer. According to him, we do not know how well this is going to work out. We have them planted that these acorns, deer will come from miles around just to eat the acorns from these oak trees. So Dusty, you might just tell them about these oak trees.
Well, they weren't mine. They were donated by Wayne Lovelace and Forrest Keeling Nursery, but they were developed on our Horticulture and Agroforestry Research Center. They're swamp white oak that are, where's Mark Cogswell? Is he around here?
Precocious.
Precocious is the word. Oh, I see. Precocious. They bear on a regular basis annually. And not all oak trees are going to be annual bearers. So those of you who are interested in grazing or finishing livestock on acorns, like your hogs or something, one of the things you'll have to overcome when you look at the natural woods are the fact that you don't get an annual acorn crop every year. But these swamp white oak do bear every year. And since, I guess there's two schools of thought. Number one is that deer are a pest and we want to get rid of them. Or number two is they are a food source. And if they're a food source or a pest, there are those that may see economic opportunity to hunt those animals, whether you want to do it on your own and as your family members, or whether you'd like to lease that ground out, especially to bow hunters that may be a little more friendly than someone firing off a rifle in the wrong direction. So I think wildlife and plantings for wildlife have a great deal of potential. Where you saw Rob Kallenbach showed a picture and people said they like what they see in the silval pasture. They like the way it looks as a park. There's a lot of hunters that have seen that and said we like the way that looks because we hunt by what we see, right? So I don't know where this should go necessarily, but I do think lease hunting is a great opportunity for those who would like to look at that as an income opportunity.
I just wanted to jump in because Mark Shepard had said, wouldn't it be nice if somebody had identified a precocious early bearing oak? And so these
I
are,
want those.
they'll start bearing at 3, but by age 6, every year you're going to get a heavy crop. So we've got them.
Yeah, Mark, if you were starting out today new in your forest system, what advice would you give people starting out?
Boy, it depends.
You had mentioned about starting, like, instead of planting a little at a time, you do it all at once.
Well, the doing it all at once part, see, I only had 200 acres. He says don't do any more than 200 acres at once because your most critical time is the first year, 2 or 3. And if, I like to tout the stun approach, sheer total utter neglect. Well, it's not totally sheer neglect. It's strategic neglect. You have to know when to neglect it. And what you're doing with your startup procedure, if I could do everything all at once again over, I would do my whole entire farm just how he did it, and have that perfect weed control for at least the first 3 years. And I would do it all at once because the maintenance, you're going to have to maintain these plants for at least 3 years, like really carefully take care of them, make sure they get their water, etc. After a while, they can kind of fend for themselves. So if you're always planting something, then you plant some more next year, you're still maintaining the first year. Then you're planting the 3rd year, maintaining. Then you're planting the 4th year, maintaining. Well, then you start to get some yields, some harvests, but it might not be enough to economically be worth your while. If you had planted 10 chestnuts at a time, year after year, you go through 10 years, you still don't have enough chestnuts to harvest to be worth it economically. So that's why I would want to do more at once, and in my case, the whole entire farm. But if I was as good as he was, I'd plant 2 farms all at once.
Well, the biggest thing is it's much easier to clear and prepare ground when you're not trying to work around freshly planted trees. And the reason we went for the alley cropping with hay was we put the hay in and had the ground ready before we ever put any trees in. So before we put any trees in, we actually harvested hay and sold it. Every year, even in the spring when we planted trees, we still harvest hay. So it's not like we have to wait for these trees to harvest something. So you want to put something in, and hay is a very good thing to put in because there's a market for hay. especially on this operation. Normally, we bale most of our hay in 1,500-pound round bales. We bale in the trees and on the tree farm in 80-pound square bales. And we found out there's a big market for this, especially among horse people, because most of them do not have equipment to handle big round bales or feed them. So my wife is kind of she figures all this stuff out and just tells me what to do. So I'm not taking credit for any of this. But she says if we would have baled the same amount of hay in 1,500-pound bales as opposed to baling it in 80-pound bales, we have doubled our money on the amount of hay, on what we sell the hay for. So you figure it out. It's a little more work, but it really fits a small area like this. It's really hard to get in and work in between these trees. You can't actually get every blade of hay around these trees. We keep a 3-foot bare section around the trees. That way the trees are not competing with the grass or weeds for water. The biggest enemy of trees is grass, so you have to keep grass away from them. So especially when they're first getting started, till they get all those little fine root system out that they collect up the water, you have to get enough moisture to them. And one of the big things with getting enough moisture to them is keep the ground clear and not let it get packed into hardpan, which it will not if you have the ground properly prepared before you plant the tree. And you can't just go till it once, rake it over and stick a tree in it. You have to, literally have to work the soil to get it aerated and get it completely broke up where it's not going to hardpan every time it gets wet and dries. And that will happen if you aerate it enough times the year before you plant. Optimum is 1 year. When you plant your trees, the next day you should be laying out your tree sites for the next year and getting them ready. And like I said, we have had less than a 2% loss of seedlings. And that is, even the Kansas Forestry Department said, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. So the big thing is, if you're gonna do something like this, know what you're getting into. It's a lot of work. Get the equipment you need, get your ground ready before you start putting stuff in the ground, because once you get stuff in the ground, the work doubles. But on the trees, every year the trees get older, there's less maintenance on them. They're easier to take care of. It's those first 2 years that are really critical. So our trees that are 6 years old, unless we go into a drought like we had in 2012, those trees will probably never have to be watered again. But your trees up to that about, first 2 years, they go 10 days. My wife will go out and check. You can buy a simple little thing that everybody should have if you're going to grow anything, and that's a soil tester. You can buy it for about $50 to $75. It tells you what the temperature is, what the pH is, and everything on the soil. And you just stick it in the ground, and in about 20 seconds, it gives you all these readings. And when that deep soil moisture down on a new planting, you stick that probe down in the ground 6 to 8 inches where those roots are, that tree, and it says the groundwater is less than 30%, you better put some water on it because those trees are dry. And the same way with pH. pH doesn't change that often, but we have had pH change for no reason year to year. You can adjust it. It's very simple. If your pH is low, put some manure on it. Just plain old manure. If the pH is high, sprinkle a little bit of lime water on it. You'd be surprised. In about 2 or 3 days, you check it and the pH will be down. It's that simple. But it's all a matter of you've got to be there and you've got to monitor the conditions of your plants.
And what's related to his reply and with the hay in between the alleys, and your question, what I would do differently, I would do more of the alley cropping, because how we got started, our primary cash flow in the early years was organic produce, much like him. And if you guys will look up here closely, I would recommend to you that you get these trees established in your silvopasture and your alley cropping system before you get too much of this in your beard, because after a while, you don't want to pick any more cucumbers. But when we would lay out our system, would make sure that the alley width was related to our equipment width. So when we're cultivating our squash or whatever our produce is, we're doing the weed control on our produce crop and on the tree crop at the same time. So we're getting weed control on both sides. So I'd do more of that. And I don't know, be set up like him and plant 2 farms at once.
Well, and 2, we set up 2 crops that we actually put fertilizer on. If you don't put fertilizer on hay, you don't get nearly as much. I mean, it pays for fertilizer. Well, I put a fertilizer mix on that's also good for the trees. If we're just fertilizing one of our hay fields, we put just basically pure nitrogen on. That encourages growth. For our tree pastures where we have hay and it's all cold weather native grass growing there, it's not brome or anything else, we use a 20-10-10 mixture. That's that's just a really powerful fertilizer. You don't have to put a lot of it on per acre. We run about 42, 43 pounds per acre. You can get it custom mixed at a fairly reasonable amount compared to going out and buying Scott's or whatever commercial fertilizer.
So
you can go to any elevator.
Are you doing a different mix for the trees versus the alleys, or what?
No,
in your
I go
ones
down
with
with
the
my
trees?
great
Okay.
big Terragator and go through and we spread that and it fertilizes the trees and the hay. And the fact that we're not going to till this ground anymore, it builds up the soil, putting the extra nutrients in it rather than just nitrogen for plant growth.
So I had a quick question for Mr. Buchanan. What is the system that you use to track your trees? And you say you have a number for each one. Where do you record all that information?
Well, every tree is assigned a number, just like a cow, like an ear tag. My wife will go by with a GPS unit, get the exact lat lawns on it, and she will record all this, on basically a sheet, what the number is, what kind of tree it is, and then she has a computer program in our home computer that she tracks it, just like we do our cattle and everything else. It's basically an agricultural program for tracking cattle, and my wife is a programmer for Goodyear, so she adapted this program to track these trees, and we literally can tell you on any tree site. Actually, the tree site is what the number is. We have had so many trees, that'll die. We don't leave that an empty space. The next year, if that tree's not doing well or it dies, we put another tree in. Well, that will all be recorded. So she can go to any location you go to, that number, you take that number back to her, she can get on her computer, pull it up, and tell you everything that's happened to that tree since the day it went in the ground, when it's been sprayed, the amounts of fertilizer and everything else. Even when we irrigate, she keeps track of the acre feet of water we put in.
And what was the product name of the tubes that you put around the trees?
Those are Tree Pros. You can order those directly from Tree Pro. You don't have to go somewhere and buy them from a second source. You can literally call Tree Pro. They will ship them to your house. We use about everything from Tree Pro. They make a self-dissolving fertilizer packet that's slow release and is good for a year. It's called a NutriPack. And these things are the best investment you could make if you're planting a tree, because they really kickstart it. You throw it in the hole right under the tree so you know where it's at. And it slow releases for the first year. And another thing, if you buy these tubes, you saw the pictures of tubes, in the summer, or in the spring when you put these on, they also make a thing that goes with the tree shelter called a bird net. And it's a very simple little piece of nylon netting, but they cost like 6 cents a piece. It keeps birds from sitting on the top of these tubes, and the manure from the birds' droppings, is highly acidic. And birds they love these tubes, and they get on these tubes. And we have actually had plant damage from the bird droppings on the leaves of very small trees. These bird nets eliminate that. So, it's not one thing, it's a total system that you do if you want to have that success. We have walnut trees that are 15 to 18 feet high, and they've been in the ground 6 years with a 3-inch diameter. So, Dusty's been to our farm, and it just, these things surprise me. I'm not a forester, I'm a farmer. And this was sort of taken on as a hobby project, and it's turned into something that actually we can see in the future. This is going to be well worthwhile for whoever takes over the farm, or my nephew or whoever. So, if you're going to get into this, do it right, get all your information. The biggest thing is know what you're getting into before you start. and there won't be the oh shit learning curve. Because it happens to everybody. They get in, they start planting these, well, why did my trees die? Or, you know, I never thought about that. I never thought about this. It's like, you know, most people never plant a tree with a post hole digger. There's a lot of people go out and plant trees with a post hole digger because it's easy. But what does a post hole digger do? When it goes in, it actually compacts the walls of the hole so the dirt doesn't cave in when you put the post in. Well, it's like planting that young tree in a pot, in a clay pot. Its leaves go out, or its roots go out as far as the loose dirt, and then it hits this wall that the post hole maker did. And it takes it forever to get through that. So it's actually the first 2 years, man, they really grow. And all of a sudden they don't grow anymore. Everybody says, I don't understand. You know, I'm watering it, I put food on, whatever. It's growing in a pot. It's restricted, its roots are restricted. So there's just lots of little things. If you're gonna do it, talk to your local foresters. They're the best source of information you can get. So
Another thing with the bird nets is they also, bluebirds will drop down in the tube to get insects, and they'll get stuck and they can't fly back
yeah,
out.
find a lot of dead ones in ones without.
And when you use the tree tubes, just be careful in the fall or when you're gonna take them off, because yellow jackets love to set up camp down in there.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask a question to Bill Stauffer. I know that you, when you put your chestnuts in, you mentioned you did pumpkins, and then you did corn, and then you did winter wheat. So I'm wondering, as you move forward, what if you have more intercrop plans, or what you plan to do in between your chestnut rows?
Well, basically, the first 2 years, we usually grow raised pumpkins, simply because the trees are growing, and it's a way to keep that. But after the pumpkins, when the pumpkins get to, or the trees get to the point where they're producing, well, we'll be planting wheat, because it gives a really nice bed of mulch to number one, it keeps the weeds down, and conserves moisture, and then it's a nice mulch to harvest the nuts off of. I mean, I don't think it particularly will work well with a mechanical harvester, but I mean, when we get to that point, we may change to sod. But right now, we keep all the vegetation away from the trees, and it's worked really well.
I have a question for either of you guys on branches as the trees get larger. Are you doing any pruning within the row, within the alley to keep from hitting it with your equipment?
Yeah, I want to be able to walk under the trees, and so we're building a superstructure that allows us to work, and we have a mechanical harvester down the road, and so we're pruning with that in mind.
We're not raising ours for nut production.
Yep.
Ours are not being raised for nut production. They're mostly in for lumber. So we're pruning them for lumber, and we prune them from the top. But we have been on the first year planting. We're just into this now this will be the 7th year. But we are this year pruning some of the first 2-year trees. We're getting branches too low for our equipment to get around them when we're haying. So yeah, we're pruning them for equipment to come by.
Because that's kind of the stage where I'm at is 20 years into it. Now I do have the problem that you had mentioned. I do have too many trees and I can't cut them fast enough, and most of it is to make sure I still get good light penetration for my intercrop in between and get through with my equipment.
Are you talking too close?
Well, the branches are starting to close in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then if I'm driving by with a tractor, when it's little, it's easy to mow or harvest whatever right next to it. But then as the branches come out across the alley, I'm trimming those off. So the trees end up looking as if they were a espalier, so their branches are now lined up with the row until they get up above the roll cage of my tractor.
Right, we planted ours on 25-foot centers, 25 feet in every direction, which has worked out fairly well. The only thing we did run into right after, 2 years ago, we had to go buy another tractor because we couldn't get our tractors between them. So we went and bought a little 55 horsepower Massey Ferguson, which is our tree farm tractor. Outside of that, we haven't had really any problems. Our equipment is sized to go under trees and things like that. Same way with our balers and things. We've got, we went and picked up a bunch of this Kubota haying equipment that can be pulled with a smaller tractor. We did the hay the first 2 or 3 years with our regular big tractor, which is a John Deere 9500, and we could just barely get down the rows and get turned around at the ends. We had trouble. We'd have to go all the way to the end and then go up the side and come back across this way to get, you know, in between them, and it just wasn't practical.
So with your square bales, are you pulling a wagon behind the baler too?
Oh, no.
Okay.
We drop them on the
Okay.
ground, and then we got a bobcat that's got a hay handler, comes by and
Alright.
stacks them up on a trailer.
Let's
No, 80-pound bales, no, we're not, there's nobody I know that's, works for me or works with me that's gonna throw 80-pound bales around
Gee,
unless
when I
Dusty
was,
comes
when
and
I was a
helps me.
kid, we used to take 2 in each hand.
So did I, but I'll be 70 in March, so I'm not taking 2 in each hand anymore.
We're going to take just 2 more questions.
A comment first, and then I got a question for Mark or Eric or both, whoever wants to answer it. The comment deals with what the young lady over here, one of the first questions was concerning the hunting end of it. I've got one place, mostly, now let me back up a second. Most of the wooded areas I lease for hunting, we get $15 to $20 an acre for those. We've got one for a client that I am a consulting forester, so a client not too far from here is getting $65 an acre. And yesterday we had a timber sale and got the landowner for 75 walnut trees. The highest bid was a little over, almost 76,000. So we averaged better than $1,000 a tree for the walnut. And there was 2 hunters there, just out of curiosity, that got the place leased. And they're paying $11,000 just for the privilege to hunt it, and 2 guys. So in other words, hunting is, to me, as far as I'm concerned, free money. And your trees can grow just as fast, and you can manage just as well. In fact, they're killing the deer, like these guys said, which is a big problem in a lot of areas. Now for the question. Well, another brief comment. Dusty mentioned about that oak tree that the university has, and Mike made a comment on it too. That oak's a swamp white oak, and that's the #1 acorn deer prefer, period. So at nurseries, when they plant the acorns at a nursery, if they don't cover those with a mesh, the first night, by the first morning after they plant, every acorn's gone. So whether the deer smell them, hear you talking down at the office, hey, we're gonna plant swamp white, they'll walk over fresh white oak acorns, red oak, black oak, whatever, to get the swamp white. These trees, as Mike mentioned, that the university has produced, that are Wayne Lovelace and Forrest Keeling produces at his nursery and sells, start producing at age 3. In the wild, if I find native swamp white oak, it's got to be 20, 25 to 30 years before they start to produce. These things are doing it at age 3. And by age 6, you know, I mean, we've got bukus acorns off of. But anyway, now for the question. You guys are doing some timber stand improvement. You're thinning your woods. You're killing your undesirables to favor your good. What are you using herbicide-wise to kill your undesirables, or are you using the herbicide?
I'm not using any herbicides. Our tree killing is for firewood and mushroom inoculation. And then I have a orchard mower, a Bertie orchard mower, that'll chip up to like 4-inch diameter material. And so when I have undesirables that are resprouting, instead of having a forest that I manage for forest and a farm that I manage for ag products, I'm managing a whole entire system. So I'm always keeping an eye on what's going on with, you know, undesirables. And so after I do an area that I cut over it, I know that I'm going to be getting resprouts of, you know, honeysuckle and buckthorn and all that. And then when I'm driving by with my mower, I accidentally, you know, suggest that it doesn't come back anymore. And it kind of keeps things damped down a little bit. But it's not perfect. I've worked with clients where we've used herbicide. Is it Garlon that we've used most, I think?
There's actually a sort of multi-layered answer to that in our case, which actually goes back to just the hunting question. And We don't use herbicide. We were a certified organic farm for most of our existence, and that applies to all of our management, whether or not it's under USDA control, so that's not an option we consider. One of the reasons we started very early on running a dairy goat herd and a meat goat herd was because we knew we had a lot of overgrown land, and we intended to use these animals as the control for these areas as we thinned them. And so that was our goal, was to use these sort of set aside. We collect the fertility from them, put it back in the vegetable fields as compost, use the goats to keep the brush down as we expand. It's this very integrated cycle, and I could have spent a 45-minute talk talking about the way we've tried to integrate all these different aspects of the farm into one thing, and I can't do that here. But as it relates to hunting, the problem we've had is that I would just as soon not have to deal with hunting, because the deer are a spectacular pest for us. We deal with hunting because we have to now. I'm not managing the woods for better hunting. I'm trying to get rid of deer, but the reality is when you improve your pastures, they love it. In 2012, one of our goat management problems in the drought was that the deer came in ahead of the goats and ate the good pasture down, because ours is the best stuff for about a mile around. So they destroyed our pasture, what was left of the pasture, before we even got the goats on it in a rotational system. So we're desperately trying to knock the deer back to the point that they aren't that problem, and if that means having a hunter pay us to do it, then great, because it's a time commitment for me to go do it. For a vegetable farmer, hunting season is a very busy time, and it's always been a pain for us to have to fit this little hunting season in this 1 or 2 week period around Thanksgiving where I'm still really busy. So, you know, in terms of getting rid of undesirables, long term we'd like to get some of the canopy open enough we can run a brush hog through if we need to. We've actually found that with goats, rotationally managing them enough to keep worm load down actually means we're not keeping them on the land enough to truly kill some of the vegetation back. We're actually rotating them through too fast, and, you know, the rosebush and stuff comes back. So we're actually rethinking some of that management, because ironically enough, our goats don't kill brush fast enough. And so again, there's all these sort of different ripple effects of the kind of integration we're trying to do, and we're still learning how to balance those things correctly. But for now, we find that either a brush hog, or frankly, just every couple of years running up through the chainsaw, it's not that hard to spend a couple days, at least at our scale, knocking back the worst of it. We've actually even experimented, and I'll stop after this, with stuff like autumn olive. You cut it off at the ground, it's just going to go crazy. We started cutting it off a foot or two above the ground, because it's going to sprout where you cut it. If you do it up here, then A, it's right at goat head level and they can take it. B, even if the goats don't do it, the next year you cut it an inch down. The next year you cut it an inch down. The next year you cut it an inch down, and it's going to be a decade before you hit the ground. But every year you're still stopping it from sprouting if you leave it up as a stop. It looks a little weird, but who cares if it means I don't have to use herbicide?
Another thing with the autumn olive, what I figured, well, I like the berries, it's kind of nice. The brush is a pain in the butt, so I would coppice around the base and leave one stem to kind of grow it like a tree, and I don't think I have a single one that's been able to survive that. So remove everything except for one stem, and they seem to die. Then it's fairly, plus I got a front end loader, and I drive by and I harass things with a front end loader every once in a while.
One last question.
I was just wondering if you guys have any substantial differences. I know we've heard extensively kind of how you prepare your land for planting, and I kind of got the idea that you maybe use the pumpkins as kind of a weed suppression. But I wonder if you could highlight any major differences without starting an argument about the best way to plant a tree.
Roots down.
I'll tell you in 10 more years.
I don't know really how to answer that question. It's just, that's what we do. It was not really recommended by the Forestry Service. They came in and gave us about a 50-page plan of how to do this, and we kind of sorted through it and said, well, we don't want to do this. They wanted us to plant them too close together, and then you do this rotational thinning and all this. We said, no, we're not going to do any of that. And basically, you know, use your good judgment on your land, what your land will support. Like ours, we're planting these, if you noticed, it's on terraced cropland. So it's fairly easy to do what we're doing, because we don't have 400 pieces of cedar and that to clear. Now, we're going to plant trees on some 100 acres that we bought just about 8-10 years ago that had not had anything done with it for 20 years, and it's covered with locust and cedar and that. So it has become a major job clearing. That's kind of what I do for relaxation, is get a tractor and a chainsaw and go cut cedar and locust. And if you've ever spent an afternoon cutting cedar and locust, you know just how relaxing that is. And anybody that wants therapy, I mean, just call me. I will show you where the cedar and locust is. I'll even provide the chainsaw.
Chainsaw first, then yoga.
And you'll feel much better. I guarantee it, maybe.
All right, on that note of Yoda wisdom, yes, Dusty?
I will tell you a couple things you heard today. That
Get
you
the,
take home
Mike,
points.
Mike.
Oh, yeah, I don't usually like talking into microphones, so that's, but I will tell you a couple of take-home points that I heard that I'll interpret some of what I heard from these guys. And the first thing you have to realize is Wisconsin is not Kansas. Soil type, moisture level, and other things. But on both of these guys, you heard about site preparation being very important. And both of these talks, Eric and Bill, I don't remember hearing this exactly from your alls, but in both of these, you heard that moisture conservation is very important, especially when trees are young and don't have the roots established. So whatever method you choose in terms of either applying water or putting on mulch to conserve moisture so that these trees have that available when they're really young especially, that's imperative to the success. And the other thing I would encourage you to do is just listen and do a lot of your own research too. Tree tubes have had great success stories. John has some great success with those tree tubes. They've undergone some evolution over time with holes being drilled for ventilation and other things. There have also been some abysmal failures as a result of the use of tree tubes. So look at what research is out there. The internet's a great source as long as you walk through it with both eyes open and a good dose of common sense, right? So, but I would suggest to you that the preparation, planning, and moisture conservation are very important to the success of any tree planting.
Just really interject real quick because we just didn't have time. There is a moisture issue I can point out that we've been doing as an experiment, and that's the biochar issue. The photo I showed was burning biochar pits. That's actually in the orchard. What we did when we started clearing seeds and setting it up in our rows of trees, in between the tree sites, we dug the biochar pits. And so it's not directly into the tree planting because we're not entirely sure how the trees will react. We're not going to plant them straight to charcoal. But we put them in between the tree sites. And the idea is that if the trees like it, they can send their roots over to that and tap into that water source. Because from our pasture experience, we know that stuff holds water in the soil more than regular clay soil does. So our goal, by putting them in between the tree sites, is hoping the trees will send the roots over. In a drought year, they'll have roots and they can tap into that. In a wet year, they'll send the root another way and they don't need that biochar. I have no idea if it works because most of these trees are maybe 3 years old and they're not just old enough for me to know. But we are experimenting with that as a way to return carbon to the soil and keep the moisture retention in those tree rows. So that's something we're playing with, and have me back in 5 years, maybe I can tell you something about how it's working. But it is something we're experimenting with, is moisture retention.
Great.
And what he touched on with the
Almost great.
with the char pits, on a lot of this ground, we have put potash on, and that will settle down through the hay and through the grass. And once you're not working ground, we're strictly no-till. We all of our ground when we plant corn, soybeans, we use an air drill, which does not open the ground up, and there is a complete little community under there of all kinds of parasites and molds and things that if you quit working the ground and exposing them to sunlight and air, which kills them, they will keep the ground porous where water will penetrate it and stuff like that. So one of the things you want to remember is don't ever overwork ground. Don't work it unless you have to. Once you get these trees planted around them, you don't do anything except keep the weeds down. And you'll find that if you've done this a year ahead of time, and you add some potash and some really aged manure, that this soil will never get hard. You can always take it and break it up. It never gets hard pan. So one of the big things is don't over farm. And that's, that caused the Dust Bowl and everything else. So when you're thinking about this and that, you want to put some of these things on that are water retention. Another thing that I forgot to mention, when you're planting trees, root dip is one of the best things you could do to help them. It's a material that you mix with water. You dip the seedlings in it, and it has like little sponge balls that expand. They stay on the roots. When you put them in the ground, they're there. And every time it rains, these things expand and hold the water right around the roots. And you can get this from Tree Pro too. It's just called root dip. It's cheap, and you mix it up. And if you have a 5-gallon bucket, you mix it about half full. You put a lid on it, it keeps till next year. It doesn't go bad. And it will retain the moisture right around your tree for years. It doesn't go away. So that's another thing I forgot to mention. That is one of the things that we do on every tree that we plant. Okay, that's it.
All right. I want to thank all of our panel again for a bunch of great talks and some great questions and answers. And again, I think it was a very interesting day all around, front to back, and we learned a lot about agroforestry today. And I also think we learned that every one of these is unique, and there is no cookie cutter way to do this. It's landowner by landowner. And thank you all for coming.